Good evening. I'm Derek Fildebrandt, publisher of the Western Standard, and you're watching The Pipeline. Today is October 19th, 2022. I'm joined, as usual, by the always dapper Western Standard opinion editor, Mr. Nigel Hannaford. How are you, Nigel?
I'm good.
You're
looking forward to getting into it.
Yeah. I know you got a lot to get off your chest today. And a guy who's always got a lot to get off his chest, Western Standard senior Alberta columnist, Cory Morgan. How are you, Cory?
Good. I'm still sweating those ribs a bit, but we'll see.
I was saying before we got on the air, you eat some bad pork, it might turn you kosher.
We'll see if it brings me to it.
Take a lot.
Yeah.
Take a lot, wouldn't it? Okay. Well, we've got a lot to talk about today. Danielle Smith, been premier now, sworn in as premier for about a week and a half or so now, but making a lot of apologies. Should Danielle Smith be apologizing for her comments, some controversial older statements in some cases surrounding the Russia-Ukraine war, newer statements surrounding discrimination against the unvaccinated? It seems like quite an apology to her. We're going to talk about why she's doing this. Should she be doing this, or should she maybe be not? But speaking of the new government here in Alberta, the Premier Smith is going to announce her new cabinet on Friday. It'll be sworn in a few days after that. Not normally the way it's done. Normally these things are announced and sworn in simultaneously. But we're going to find out who the new cabinet is. We're going to we'll speculate about who we think will be in and who we think will be out, but also who should be in and who should be out. What kind of message is she going to be sending here? And the national inquiry going on in Ottawa, the big circus. Is Trudeau on trial here for the appropriateness of invoking the Emergencies or War Measures Act? Or is the Freedom Convoy on trial for its attempt to overthrow democracy and plunge us into a new dark age? So we're going to deal with the three of those. Before we get going, though, we got to thank my favorite sponsor, the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. I've been a member of the CSSA for well over a decade because I trust them with my membership dues to defend my rights as a lawful firearms owner in Canada. Without the CSSA, our basic rights to own, purchase, and use firearms Canada would already be almost entirely gone. You know that that's where the federal government wants to go with your gun rights. And it takes organizations like the Canadian Shooting Sports Association that are the leading firearms organization in Canada, defending your rights against the federal government that are trying to take things that many of us will not give up except from our cold, dead hands. So if you're not yet a member of the CSSA, go to CSSA-CILA. See, if I don't write it down, it's impossible. CSSA-CILA.org. Or just Google them, like I do whenever I want to go to them. And become a member today. It's money very, very, very well spent. Speaking of money well spent, if you're also not yet a member of the Western Standard, you need to be. The Western Standard is one of the only bailout-free media left in all of Canada. It's a very, very small number of media that refuse to take Justin Trudeau's media bailout money. The Western Standard, we're now actually coming up to our third anniversary in just a few days here, 3 years, and we've built something absolutely incredible. I'm very proud of, and we could not have done without the support of each and every one of you. If you're not yet a member, go to westernstandard.news, click on membership. It's only $10 a month or $100 a year for unlimited access to all of our content. You're going to love it. All right, so let's get into it. Right out of the gate, Danielle Smith sworn in as premier, and she gives a press conference afterwards, and she says something to the effect of, the unvaccinated are the most.
In all her short life,
yes,
she had never seen a group of people
more discriminated against than the unvaccinated. Well, there has been certainly discrimination in her life. I don't recall any other group that was not allowed to go to a restaurant, that was not allowed to travel, that was not allowed to engage in very basic functions that people in a nominally free country are allowed to. But I think, as could probably be expected, some people took issue with this, and it kind of blew up. And they said, well, what about Group X? What about Group Y? And the unvaccinated don't deserve this sympathy. she apologized. Do you think she has anything to apologize for in those comments?
Not at all. I was sitting right there when she said them, and my first reaction was, thank goodness somebody's out and said it. We had a rough time as we were unvaccinated. It was a very clear case of discrimination. That's not to say nobody else ever got discriminated against in the 50 or so years that she's talking about. But this was us, and this was last year and the year before. And in my view, there was nothing in that to apologize for. She spoke no more than the truth. What's going on here? And watch how this plays out. She's been a radio host for 7 years, and she's been an opinion columnist in the Calgary Herald for 6 years. And the NDP have got their team of researchers going through everything she's ever said, or everything she's ever done, and everything she's written. And they will drop one of these out every week in order to contrive a narrative that, first of all, she's been wrong all these years, and secondly, that she's now apologizing. It's pretty obvious. She needs to stop apologizing. She needs to say, this is what she needs to say. She needs to say, once I was a writer for an editorial page, once I was a columnist, I was a talk show host. And, I said things to get discussion going. Now I'm the premier. I'm going to be saying things in a different way. I'm not apologizing anymore.
Well, some of this is new, like her comments around the unvaccinated being discriminated against. Some of this is older, some much older, but some just a little bit old. Smith in her newsletter wrote some comments around really around the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine that I think it's fair to say part from the party line that is supposed to be accepted that this conflict, like every conflict Canada's ever had a side in, is always black and white, and there is always 100% good guys and 100% bad guys, and there's never any nuance to how these things start. I certainly didn't read her comments as anti-Ukraine or pro-Russian or pro-Putin, but certainly became spun that way. And she apologized for that. Now, I guess with the unvaccinated one, she issued a clarification, not technically an apology, but it came across as an apology. Ukraine, I think it was outright, pretty much more of an apology. Some of these things the NDP are digging up are much older. I think the one thing from the 90s where she talked about, it was a rather curious comment that moderate smoking might actually be good for you. I would be hard pressed to think that she would believe that today.
But I think it requires more research.
Yeah. But Cory, it's kind of become really from the first day now where she's either said something and is apologizing, or something else has been dug up from the past and she's apologizing. Is this, do you think, the right way for her to move on from these things? No. Say, I'm sorry, let's move on? Or do you think she needs to dig in her heels a bit here?
You won't stop the wolves by throwing meat at them. They've seen her reverse lights, and they're going to keep coming. You only inflame them when you apologize to them. These are people that despise her. They're the ones who are most inflamed about her comments. Nothing is going to pacify them. And once they've beaten one to death, as Nigel said, they're going to have a long list. They'll start the next one. And maybe she's got to come out, I think, with a blanket statement just to clarify that. Look, I'm in a new role. She's got to learn a bit herself. To be fair, that first statement, she spoke like a talk show host rather than a premier, and that's why she got into the soup. She's a premier now. She's got to learn how to parse her own words to make sure they can't be taken out of context or used against her. She's in a different role, but she's smart. She'll figure that out fast. But she's got to stop this, or they will bleed her a death of 1,000 cuts all the way to the next election. She's got to say, I'm not going to address those things any longer. That was stuff in the context of exploring ideas, being a talk show host, being a columnist. Some of my views might have changed. Some of them might have been just exploratory at the time, but I can't sit and address every little one of these things. That discussion's closed. We're working on, and then just say that's it. We're working on AHS. We're working on the Sovereignty Act. We're working on reducing the cost of living. I'm a premier now. I don't have time for that petty stuff. She's got to stop it, because it's only going to get worse every time they get another apology out of her.
So let's talk kind of apology strategy. Jason Kenney, I think, was on the other side where he could run someone over and he would not apologize. He just generally, with extraordinarily few exceptions, did not apologize, including cases where it was pretty clearly warranted an apology was required. Smith seems to be now apologizing, I think, much too liberally. Perhaps this might be a symptom of the 7-year apology tour she's been on for her actions with the floor crossing that were so clearly warranting of an apology and groveling and sackcloth and ashes and anything she could possibly do to show contrition. Nigel, do you think it's possible that, her being stuck in this apology limbo, which was probably necessary for 7 years, has maybe just preconditioned her to the point where anything goes wrong, she feels the need to just kind of apologize?
Well, I don't think so, no. I mean, when she was on the campaign trail in search of the leadership, I didn't pick that up from her in anything she said. I mean, people would put her on the spot and she'd, yeah, well, that's what I did.
Well, those were generally attacks on, other than, and she did apologize during the leadership campaign on the floor crossing ordeal, but on everything else she did, because those are generally, she apologized on the kind of the cancer and things you can do to prevent cancer comments. But she generally didn't apologize much, but there was some, but she certainly wasn't all over. But now that she's premier, the attacks are different. These are different kind of attacks, and it's a different tempo. She's no longer just the candidate, she's the premier. So when one of these attacks come at her, it's front page of all the legacy media right away. And it's a lot more heat. So I guess I'll kind of just reframe the question that way, that is the heat so great now that she's conditioned that when that heat comes on her that she feels the need to just apologize?
Well, I don't think so, and I certainly hope not. Things you apologize for are when it's like bad manners. I remember a time back when Ralph Klein was premier. He went out, probably had a little more to drink than he should. He ended up outside a homeless center and was throwing money on the sidewalk to the people there. That was not nice. And he apologized for it. And Rolf did a number of things during the time that he was premier, which were like that and worth apologizing for. And he had that gift of saying, gee, shucks, there I go, I did it again. People sort of smiled and said, oh, that's Rolf, but at least he apologizes. This kind of things that she's being taken to task for now are not of that nature. They are ideological. They are, do you apologize for what you think and who you are? And she can't say, I apologize for those things, because we voted for Danielle Smith on what we saw.
Well, used to be members did. Albertans haven't had a chance yet.
Well, that's true. But I mean, that's the party membership chose her for what she was, for not what she's apologizing for.
Cory, what do you think the risk is if this continues? Surely some of it is, as you've both said, she is the pundit premier. She is still sort of working her way out of being a talk show host and a columnist. She went from talk radio to some business advocacy, and then she was here for about 2 months with a show and a bit of writing, and then straight into a campaign. And she kind of did step in it a bit with her comments around cancer, whatnot. I don't think she meant anything bad by it, but came across very poorly during the campaign. I don't think she was wrong at all with her comments about the unvaccinated being discriminated against, but I could, as soon as she said it, I was like, oh, I know some people who are going to lose their minds here. Do you think she has to be a lot more careful about what she's saying, or does she then risk losing that authenticity, that kind of aw shucksness that she has that makes her charming and an attractive leader to many people?
She has to change how she's speaking because she's the premier now. It's different. It's not the same as when you're a radio host speculating on something, or when you're a columnist speculating on something. Now you are in a position of authority, a position with some power. So you do have to watch what you're saying now, because it holds a lot more weight to it. But she can't keep apologizing for the past. The risk there is letting her opponents own the narrative for the next 7 months, and the biggest risk will be Premier Rachel Notley. She can't have that. She's got a big plan. She's got a big agenda. And if she's constantly having to address things she said in the past over the next few months, and hey, if I was a strategist at the NDP, that's exactly what I'd be getting ready to do. Let's keep owning the agenda, keep her reactive all the time. She'll lose. She will lose. So this was a bad sign with this recent one. I understand the pressures are coming on. She's got a million things to think of at once. She's probably got 10 voices in her ears, all have the best idea on earth on how to win the next election. But she can't let them grab this and own her, because they will. And it's a mob, and you can't pacify them.
So hopefully she'll have no apologies to make about her cabinet.
Yeah, if she's in office too, just to add further, yeah, as Nigel was saying, if she makes a big mistake, a policy mistake or something while premier, that's when I want to see an apology. If she's truly contrite and feels she did something wrong, I don't. That's better to see that than, as you said with Kenny, digging in his heels and just refusing. It's just this going over the past thing. It can't be done any longer.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about Smith's new cabinet coming in. We're going to see she's taken some time. It was very unusual or unconventional transition. She almost immediately was sworn in as premier. Normally, when a leader succeeds a leader that's already in government, a prime minister succeeding prime minister in the same party, or premier succeeding premier in the same party. Usually, there's a fairly cordial handing over of power, and there's at least 2 weeks or so. That's usual. If it's a new party taking over, sometimes up to even 3. There's a big transition here. Smith more or less walked off the stage at the leadership convention and went straight to the lieutenant governor's house and said, "Swear me in." It was a matter of days. It was the fastest I've ever seen. And very unusually, she did not swear in her cabinet at the same time. Normally, the premier or the prime minister is sworn in at the same ceremony as the cabinet. She hadn't even, I think, put a ton of thought into the cabinet at that time, other than her transition team's general ideas. She just come through a caucus retreat where she sat down with every single member, I think 60 or so members of their caucus, interviewed them all, and on Friday she's going to announce her cabinet. Also unusually is she's then going to wait a few more days to swear them in early in the next week, I think the Monday or the Tuesday. But we're finally going to get to see it. What are the big things, Corey, that you want to see in this? Not what you think you're going to see, but that you want to see in Smith's new cabinet.
I want to see some ministers with an appetite for reform. This is a new leader. I want to see a new flavor in this government. At the same time, I know she has to juggle party unity. She doesn't want to shun the Kenny loyalists. That's how you get a party rift. So some of the past cabinet ministers should remain in, but I do want to see in those senior positions, I want to see somebody in health who is then willing to say, yes, we're going to shake up AHS. We're going to change some stuff. Intergovernmental affairs, I don't know if we have a provincial cabinet posting, but whoever be, think people in that role, then have it reflect her platform of saying, yes, we're not going to take a soft stance with Ottawa. Justice Minister, let's strongly look at the police. I guess not a rebellious cabinet, but I want to see ones that are reflecting the new leadership and pushing that agenda, not just built to pacify people within caucus.
Well, actually, before I go to you, Nigel, is there any individuals you want to see in and want to see out?
I don't see too many I really want to see. That's part of the problem we've had with the Kenny governments. You haven't heard from anybody else. I'm not sure what rising stars are in that caucus and aren't. They've been so quiet. I'm sure there's some very talented people, and I can't really write a good list of who would be better. There's ones that carry a lot of past baggage, though. Tyler Shandro is an example of it. I don't know if he could sit there without Danielle having to wear some of Jason Kenney's past luggage, Taves, on the other hand, though, he didn't, even though he was part of the inner circle, didn't seem to carry as much of that. And maybe, again, for the sake of unity, giving him a senior position would be good. She's got a lot to think about.
Well, he was not directly, he was a part of the inner cabinet that made a lot of these COVID lockdown.
He was in the Sky Palace.
He was a part of these things. But it doesn't quite stick to him the same way it does with Shandro or even Nixon.
And that was interesting. He was on. I saw an interview of him this morning, actually, outside the caucus retreat, and speaking very positively, anyways. But perhaps that's when you're on your way in to see if you can't save your cabinet position or not. I don't know. It's hard to tell how it's going within caucus. But Nixon, definitely is known to be closely tied with Kenny, and he couldn't be a problem for Smith if he's in cabinet. So she's got to think very carefully on that. But he could be a problem if she shuns him too.
So Nigel, before we get to what we're expecting, we're going to come to that in a bit. What is it you want to see in this? Who do you want in? Who do you want out? Who do you think should stay? Who do you think should be some new additions? If you're advising Danielle Smith, and she says, write me up a memo. Who you think should be in, who should be out, who should stay. What are the big names that come to mind?
Well, first of all, I'm a great believer in that old saying that you keep your friends close, but you keep your enemies closer. So if there is anybody that she feels may be part of a kind of a shadow group of people within the party, but who are not actually in government, she'd be best to pull them out of there, give them an incentive to.
But that's most of the current cabinet.
Well, it could be.
Like most of that, almost, I think she had only one cabinet minister, Casey Madhu, supporting her. The rest of the cabinet, either publicly or quietly opposed her to one degree or another.
The biggest problem, let's just say that she wins the next election, which we all hope and pray she does. The time of when this shadow group would come into their own would be after that. I cannot believe, and I dare not believe, that those MLAs, cabinet ministers, members of the UCP who presently sit there in the legislature would rather undermine her now to make a point than get elected in May next year. So I think she can actually count on the overt support, at least, of just about anybody that she's likely to pick. And the person that I would, to address your point, the person that I would be looking for first is finance, for whom I would pick Trevor Taves. Unlike Cory, I would leave Tyler Shandro as Attorney General because I don't know. I had a quick look to see who else was available, and
They have a fair number of lawyers.
they have 7, and but of the 7, I think he is the preferred. He's the one I would prefer. I would leave Ariana Lagrange in education. Well, that's it. And in health, I kind of like what Copping's doing. So I think there's quite a lot to be said for not making major changes in the cabinet at this point.
What about Nixon? So Nixon is currently the finance minister. I'm not sure. He also might be the environment minister at the same time. I'm not sure if that was shuffled off, but he stepped into finance when Taves
came
yeah,
out. Yeah.
And he was House Leader under Kenny. He was really his right-hand man. I think there'd also be incredible tensions. I cannot imagine Brian Jean, we have not really talked much about here, but Brian Jean sitting at the same cabinet table as Jason Nixon. It's not known to a lot of people, but Jason Nixon stabbed Jean straight in the back during the last UCP, the previous UCP leadership race. He was part of Kenny's inner circle up until the very morning that he sent out a news release endorsing Jason Kenney. So he was sitting around privy to all his inside stuff. There is, it's beyond bad blood. In fact, I think the relationship between Jean and Nixon is probably worse between Jean and Kenney because it was so personal, it was a betrayal. And there's a lot of hard feelings in the UCP caucus currently surrounding Nixon, the way he's kind of put the elbows up, enforcing Kenney's discipline on the caucus. Do you think Smith would be advised to keep him in? You've generally advised keeping that team there. Do you think she'd be advised to keep him in or maybe show him the door?
I am not privy to all of the things that you just explained there. On the basis of what you just said, probably not. I don't know that story well enough to offer an erudite comment on it. But as a general principle, most of the leadership contenders have come forward and either put out a statement saying that they will support Smith and that they are working for party unity and looking forward to the election. If that's the attitude, then keep them busy. Give them some reason, a personal reason to stay loyal and not be on the outside of the fence looking in and plotting, waiting for their chance.
Jean's an interesting one to contain.
Yeah, let's take a moment to talk about Jean. Everyone kind of forgot about Jean.
If I could, and I could be wrong, I don't want to be too unfair to Brian on it, but if I could think of one person who would potentially try to raise a caucus revolt and cross the floor with a handful of members, I could think of Jean potentially doing it. And maybe he wouldn't, I could be way off base, but he's a person who's going to have to be carefully managed within there. Mm-hmm. And it's not just Nixon he bristled with in caucus. There's a few folks, but still the only way to quiet him perhaps is to bring him into cabinet. Where do you put Jean? That's she's got some tough decisions. I mean, you can see why they get that temptation just to make a giant cabinet. There, we can just stick everybody in there. And
well, that's why it's one of the
yes.
reasons Canada has the largest cabinets on the planet. Our cabinet is something like 3 to 4 times the size of the American cabinet that runs the most powerful government on the planet. Little Canada has a cabinet 4 times the size. That's obviously for very political reasons, multifaceted political reasons, going back to Confederation and before. But with Brian Jean, I want to ask you, Nigel. Bringing them in, giving them a stake in something is one way to ensure loyalty. But if it doesn't ensure loyalty, it makes them a bigger threat down the road if they do become problematic. Do you think Smith would be wise? I also have a feeling he's not going to take just any cabinet post. He probably feels, Brian Jean deserves one of the big ones. Do you think she'd be smart to do that, or to more or less offer him something he might not necessarily take and quietly encourage his third retirement?
Well, if I were her, I would, as I say, keep the people who are likely to give me the most trouble close. And he is certainly somebody who may not, he put out, again, he's one of the ones who put out a very conciliatory statement after it was all done. You should do that. Don't make more of that than one should. But there are ministries where he could sit out 7 months and see how the voters think about it in May. I would say perhaps environment, or even energy.
All right,
Fort McMurray. He's got an interest there. He knows a bit about it.
Well, we've talked about who should more or less. Jean's the only one we've talked about potentially coming in. I do think Smith would be wise to make this her cabinet, not just the Kenney government plus Smith. I don't think that would send really the right message. Who currently not in cabinet, other than Jean, since we've talked about him now, who currently not in the cabinet but sitting in that caucus, do you think she should consider promoting?
Well, Todd Lowen for a start.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just Todd?
Do you count Rachel Schultz as part of the?
Everybody who was before they had to resign to run. So I think Schultz effectively would consider still there, even though she's not technically there.
Schultz is definitely a cabinet minister material. She already was a cabinet minister for children's ministries. She fought a very clean campaign. That's been noticed. It's also been publicly commented on. She'd be a very easy one for Danielle to bring in and probably give a good job to. Better one than the one that she had before.
Corey, no one's talked about these two.
Sonny
and Ahir.
Yeah, I was waiting for that.
The 1% Club. I think together they got about 1%.
I don't see how they serve any good purpose to keep them within. They ran nasty negative campaigns. They don't draw much support of the party membership whatsoever. I shouldn't say get rid of them altogether. Let the constituencies, which Ahir already has quite a hornet's nest going on in her own. I think Sonny's probably comfortable within hers, but they don't belong in cabinet. There's no sense bringing them in.
Speaking of Ahir, we know she's on track to lose her nomination now. It seems almost impossible that she keeps it unless she's protected for a third time. You heard it here. There is a movement afoot to move her to Calgary Elbow. You heard it here. There is that doesn't mean it's going to happen, but there are some players in the party who know she's going down. She cannot get renominated, Jestomir Strathmore, and because if she gets defeated there, she'll probably cross the floor to the NDP or the Alberta Party or the Liberals or something to the left of the UCP.
It's the Alberta Party. They're the catchment of those discards.
Yeah, they're due for another floor crossing that survives a few months again. But a way to stop her from doing that would be to put her in Elbow, where she might have a prayer of holding that seat for the UCP. It's currently open. Doug Schweitzer's resigned, and they haven't held a by-election, which is very odd. This is very odd because normally if there's vacant seats and you have a by-election, you have a by-election for all of the vacant seats. And we talked about this last week. I don't think it looks good on Smith to not hold the by-election in Elbow. It looks like they're afraid. And I know why they're afraid. They might lose that seat to the NDP. It's a downtown urban seat, and there's a lot of There's some hoity-toity types in the area who might not like a populist party very much. They prefer the NDP. But it's another sign that maybe that there's a game afoot here, because you couldn't have held that by-election if you were moving a sitting MLA to it, because it would look ridiculous for someone to resign a seat in one riding to run in a by-election in another, and then essentially have 3 by-elections. That would look comical. But you heard it here. There's a movement afoot in the UCP as a way to keep her from crossing the floor, even though she's going to lose that riding.
I think that would be terrible. I mean, you're parachuting one who just got rejected from her rural constituency on the outside of the city into a swing riding within Calgary. And let's face it, I mean, I like Leela. I really actually do, but she's not a strong campaigner. You need somebody who's a workhorse and personable and good and preferably local if you're going to hope to win Elbow in May. And here, I think it would be an insult, a second insult to the voters of Elbow if you deferred their by-election already for 7 months, and then for just purely political partisan reasons, you flip somebody like a here over there to be the candidate.
But
I think it would end terribly.
The idea of that strategy, and I'm not saying it's happening.
Yeah.
There's a very good chance it's not. In fact, if they actually, unless she got appointed to that riding, I don't think she'd win the nomination in Elbow either.
Yeah.
But it would be a way to get her to not cross the floor to the NDP or the Alberta Party or the Liberals. Because she probably will end up with someone other than the UCP if she loses the nomination there.
Take your losses.
What a mess. What a mess. Okay, now quickly, start with you, Nigel. What are you expecting from the new cabinet? What are you expecting to see when this is announced Friday?
Well, I'm expecting to see what I pretty much laid out there. There's a lot of people we know very well occupying very similar positions. So that's not really that exciting, I'm afraid.
Any big changes you're expecting in there?
Maybe not big ones. Like I said, with the backbench, I don't see any names aside from, say, Todd Lowen and some others who are standing out. The only thing I'd expect from the cabinet is I think they're going to be tasked, though, to really hit the ground running. I don't think she's going to want to move slowly. She's got 7 months to say, this is the new government, and we're going to get stuff done.
Not a lot of time to measure the drapes.
No.
The one thing I would hope is that Danielle, as she has won her place on the basis of the Sovereignty Act, that she would take the lead on intergovernmental relations. She would be the obvious. She is the premier.
First
she
minister,
has to,
That's what Kenny did. At first, I thought when Kenny did it might be good, but the premier, if you're an active premier, you're taking the lead in all the ministries. The idea of having a minister is someone to mind that file while you're distracted with something else. So because Kenny was Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, well, Intergovernmental Affairs got completely forgot as soon as COVID happened. There was no minister stick handling that. Now, I think you could consolidate a bunch of these ministries. I don't think you need 30 cabinet ministers and a legislature of 87 people. You could have not that I expect the cabinet to get significantly shrunk, but you could probably get away with a cabinet of 10. But I don't know. I think that portfolio probably should get with another minister. That's the idea of having ministers, is so that when the premier or the prime minister's attention is drawn elsewhere by events, as inevitably happens, there's still someone moving that file forward and it doesn't get forgotten the way intergovernmental affairs has been completely forgotten over the last 2 years.
Well, that's a pretty fair argument. And yet, so she has invested so much in the relationship between Alberta and Ottawa that it almost behooves her to go out and show how it's done.
Well, she would definitely take the lead on it, but
what she's going to be judged on.
Ralph Klein ran in '93. It was about getting the budget under control, but he wasn't also simultaneously the finance minister. He still had a finance minister to do that, even though that was the overwhelming focus of the government, was stopping the debt crisis. But yeah, I think one way or another, if she's the intergovernmental affairs minister or not, she's going to be the face of it.
She's going to be the face.
No one's going to care about whatever minister they put in there as intergovernmental affairs minister. They'll probably do a lot of the work, but it's the premier's face you're going to see on these things.
And it needs to be.
Yeah. Other than Lowen going in, I think Nixon's going in. I think she knows that there's just too much politics there. I could be very wrong, but I'm giving a 51% chance Nixon's out. I'm giving a 99% chance Lowen is in. And I look for a few other MLAs that supported Smith coming in. Jason Steffen, he's a lawyer.
I could see Savage being out.
Well, actually, I think Savage said she's not running again, right?
Did she? Okay.
Yeah. I would bet every minister who's not running again is out.
It's an easy out there.
Well, yeah.
Because being a minister helps you get reelected. You've got more profile, bigger office budget for communications. being in cabinet helps you, gives you a marginal edge if you're in a close race. So I don't think anyone. So I think Savage said she's not running. I don't expect Savage to be in that cabinet then.
Definitely not if she said she's not running.
Prediction: 100% chance Jason Kenney's out of cabinet.
I asked. I actually asked Danielle about that when I had her on the show.
Oh, what'd she say?
She said it would be very awkward and inappropriate. I even just asked what role he might have in the government, like even in a associate minister or statesman sort of place, and she made it pretty clear that he's not going to have much of anything. I think that would have been quite a surprise. Yeah.
But watch Jason Stephan. I think you could see in
Guthrie.
Guthrie. Actually, I think there's a good chance you could see Guthrie in.
But and those are guys who are a bit rebellious too, though. So you gotta...
Well, they were rebels, but they were, and this is an interesting thing. They were on Smith's side of the rebellion against Kenney, but they were rebels.
Yes,
and
so
and rebels
they can get prickly on the next one just as easily.
Yeah, we'll see. Okay, so let's move on to the whole other end of the political mess here in Ottawa. The national inquiry that's taking place into the federal government's invocation of the Emergencies or War Measures Act. We're now a few days into this, or about how long are we into this? At least a few days.
Yeah, well, that's Thursday last week, wasn't it?
Yeah, started last week. Okay, so better part of a work week. They seem to be starting with the small fish and working their way up. They're starting with like municipal officials, and I saw on the TV it said Ottawa resident. I was like, oh, how did that guy get in there? Just Ottawa resident. I don't know who elected him, but okay, sure, Ottawa resident. So they're starting with small fish and working their way up. It's kind of a mess right now of just different officials on the municipal and policing level pointing the finger at each other saying, well, I did my job. This guy screwed up. But we've got also sense from the opening statements about where this is going to go. And that's why we're calling this segment Trudeau or the Convoy on trial. And I think that is how the Canadian public is going to see this. How well that's borne out by the process and the testimony is to be seen. But from the sense you're getting, even though we're still pretty early days in this, Nigel, are we seeing this as more of a trial of Trudeau or of the Convoy?
The intention will definitely be to show the Convoy in a bad light. It's an interesting thing that we've got something called an Emergencies Act. You could never have invoked the War Measures Act. Now that's old news, the name of the change. But calling it an Emergencies Act, yeah, you could, a lot of people would forgive you for thinking this was an emergency. So who are the emergency? Well, there's all these trucks parked there. And they have a different idea to the government. So very much as the Democrat Party is trying to run a narrative around January the 6th. So I think this government is using this inquiry as a narrative building exercise to portray the truckers as who they say they are: deplorable people, misogynistic, racist, unacceptable opinions. We've all been through that list of all the ugly things.
Just summarize it as unvaccinated.
Summarize it?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but then
if you just say unvaccinated, it means all of those things.
That is considered to be unacceptable. And some people say, well, actually, I'm not vaccinated. I'm happy with that the way you are. I don't ask you to be unvaccinated if that's your. So what we've got is a very definite narrative building there. And you bet the whole idea is to present the truckers and everybody who supported them as being sinister, uneducated, anti-establishment. And on the basis of that, they hope they get a verdict that will enable them to get elected again sometime in the future. They have to win the public relations exercise. That's why you're seeing, the sort of the humble people, and then the slightly less humble people, and then the downright arrogant ones, and then the ones who twist the truth. I mean, what do we have? Mendocino saying that Ottawa was ungovernable? Good Lord. I
think that's a good thing.
When they were served an injunction to stop honking their horns, they stopped honking their horns. Obviously, there was some government going on there. And in actual fact, you were safer walking up and down among the trucks than you would have been walking 2 blocks down on Spark Street. This is a PR exercise from beginning to end.
Corey, from what you've seen of the testimony and the way the inquiry's been conducted so far, do you expect the government to? I think there's two broad strategies. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but in terms of the way they're going to try and tee this up, is it primarily to defend their use, make the case that, well, here was a problem and this was the only way to address it? Or do you expect it to be less of a focus on defending its use, or actually I should say, defend its use by purely talking about the Freedom Convoy and the great danger to civilization it posed?
Yeah, the lazy way is just to keep shooting at the convoy and talk about how crazy they are or what was wrong. And, even if you concluded that they were dead wrong and that you conclude they overstayed their welcome and they should be removed, that still doesn't mean you needed the Emergencies Act.
No, but
that's the point they should be trying to make. But the lazy, easier point to make is just to keep throwing mud and demonizing the convoy and hoping people don't even pay attention to what the basis of this inquiry is.
Will they get away with that? Is the question. Is to convince a majority of left and center left voters in Canada that they were in the right on this issue? Do they need to convince the public that the Emergencies Act was necessary, or do they just need to make the case that these were bad people and we did tough things to bad people? Similar to what Pierre Trudeau did with using the War Measures Act during the FLQ crisis. I mean, it was obviously a bad thing, but
well, people were getting killed.
Yeah.
I mean, that
if the convoyers
two
were
people were
kidnapping
killed
and murdering people, I would support the Emergencies Act against them too.
well, I don't know. Like we kind of, at least in English Canada, we've just kind of accepted that over time. Like it was much more serious. 2 people were assassinated, and there was some minor bombings that didn't have people killed, but it was bad. But sending the troops in, warrantless searches of homes and arrests without habeas corpus, it probably was a giant overreaction. But Pierre Trudeau didn't need to convince people that the War Measures Act was necessary. He just needed to convince people that the Quebec separatists were really bad guys. And then people more or less didn't care about, was the War Measures Act an appropriate tool, the necessary, needed tool to deal with it. People didn't care about it after there because the argument was made. It was a pretty easy argument to make that the FLQ and anyone who supported them were just bad guys. So what I'm getting at now is this the same strategy? Does Trudeau not need to make the case that the Emergencies Act was necessary and required, and instead just has to make the argument that the Freedom Convoy were a threat to democracy?
well, that's what I'm arguing.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think that's.
But will he get away with it?
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
they
he
will.
will.
The public doesn't think that nuanced, unfortunately. There's policy weenies and people like ourselves who look at historical authoritarian regimes and see the tools they use and understand the significance of suspending civil rights to deal with an emergency. They're talking about press gangs essentially to force truckers into forced labor. But your average citizen doesn't.
That's
think of
exactly what that was.
I hate to, but unfortunately the Kardashians dominate the news. They're not going to think that deeply on the policy. And that's part of the reason you want to see one of the biggest things that are going to be covered is when King takes the stand, Pat King, because he's one of the ones on the list. He sort of personifies a lot of the fringe aspect that was a part of the
He
movement.
will help the Liberals' case in that.
I think they will try to prod the crazy out of him.
He is
And,
amongst the least sympathetic figures involved.
Yeah, Tamara Leach, they'll probably want on and off the stand fast. She's sympathetic, she's smart, she's controlled. Pat King could potentially go off on that tangent. You see, did you want that man taking over Ottawa? Again, it's irrational, but that's how you win the points. And we've got a very complicit legacy media who will more than happily feed that pablum to the masses as this comes out.
There's an awful lot of people who say they value freedom, but when somebody actually does something a little unusual to stand for freedom, then, I don't know that I would go that far, and they back off. And they're the ones who will probably find this whole theater to support their view that the truckers were kind of a little bit working class for their tastes, and therefore they don't back them.
Well, everyone's on the right side of history when you're reading it in the books.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and I like how you keep mentioning, and I like to keep mentioning too, the War Measures Act, because that really drove home how serious this act is and the sort of circumstances where something like this should be imposed. An Emergencies Act could mean any flood or a
that's
heat
right.
wave. And this should be of the most serious of last resorts. The aliens should be landing before you think about it.
Outside of the First and Second World Wars, the war measures or its successor, the Emergencies Act, has only been used twice. And it's been used by the same family. That should say something. Outside of world wars, it's only been used by two guys with the same last name. All right. Well, let's wrap it up there. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And thank you all for joining us today. If you're not yet a member of the Western Standard, good God, you need to be. Go to westernstandard.news right now. Click on membership. It's only $10 a month or $100 a year for unlimited access, and you'll be supporting independent, bailout-free Western media like the Western Standard. Corey, Nigel.
Always a pleasure.
I love it. Thank you very much. And thank all of you, and God bless.
Alberta Prosperity Project is dedicated to protecting Alberta's world-class energy sector and has invited Alex Epstein, American author of the best-selling new book, Fossil Future, to speak on the importance of fossil fuels and the vital role they play in our economy. Join us on Friday, October 28th at the Westin Calgary Airport for Beef and Beer with Alex Epstein. You will not want to miss this. Buy your tickets at www.albertaprosperityevents.com today.